So this is the second of two lectures on Apuleius The Golden Ass. The first lecture focused on Cupid and Psyche, the little story within the story, which prefigures, or which is a, let's say, an encapsulation of the story of the Trials of Lucius. And as we said in the last lecture, it gives us a vivid image of the birth of the historical concept of the immortal soul and the trials that it has to go through before the merely mortal psyche can become immortal psyche, or the mere human can be said to be endowed with an immortal soul. This story is the story. The larger frame is the story of Lucius, who becomes who is a man who is traveling. He on his travels, he becomes really, you can see that he's he's somebody who's very interested, very curious about sorcery, and he's also oversexed. He's very obsessed with two things: sex and sorcery, and this is going to lead to his undoing. And so this is a kind of a funny story. It's been the inspiration for many works of literature in the years to follow after its publication in the second century, some 1900 years ago. The obvious example in the English language is Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, which was directly influenced by Apuleius The Golden Ass. But and then of course George Balanchine did a wonderful ballet based on Midsummer Night's Dream. And then of course there's the long history of the novels that are to follow that are interested in this question of animal metamorphosis, linked to the development of the idea of what it means to be an I, what it means to be an individual, what it means to have a self. In the last lecture I quoted Frederick Jameson, who said, the novel is a machine for constructing subjectivity. Okay, well, that's putting it in sort of more sort of Kantian, Hegelian terms, but in the context of Lucius and the Golden Ass, we could think of a machine to construct a self. And how does Lucius construct a self in the telling of the narrative? And so, because it's such an early instance of the novel, it's also an early instance of the autobiography. It's a wonderful story, and it has a lot to teach us. So in this lecture, I want to go through the story of Lucius, and we'll see what he has to say in this tale as well. Okay. Okay, so you can see there a mosaic from of a donkey. Donkeys are, asses. Donkeys are, if you've been around them much, they are, when they start to bray, it's, there is something extraordinarily obnoxious about the braying of the donkey, and so, or the ass. And so the poor ass gets a lot of abuse in the history of literature as a sort of a figure of the stupid beast, or the stupidest of beasts. And so even to this day, we call someone a dumbass or an ass or a stupid ass. It's linked to this kind of idea. And so when Lucius gets turned into an ass, he's being turned into in effect the stupidest of the beasts. He wants to become an owl. He wants to sail to the heavens as a bird, but fate would have it that he gets transformed into an ass rather than the owl that he's hoping to become. Okay, well, I showed you this image of Apuleius in our last talk. I won't go over all of his previous works, which I've already discussed, except to note again, look at the dates there of his life, 124 to 170. So, he was born about 100 years after the time that Christ died, as told in the biblical texts. And he precedes Augustine, which is interesting. We'll return to that. But One of the questions I want to focus on here is we're sort of, again, thinking of this in the background. We want to just consider this because here we have kind of the birth of a genre, the birth, and not maybe even not necessarily the novel, because I already said there are instances of novels in antiquity besides this, like the case of Daphnis and Chloe that I mentioned earlier. But in terms of an autobiography, this is one of the things that, if you're a student of literature, this is one of the things that makes this text so important, is because it is a really early instance of an autobiographical narrative. Now, it's of course fictionalized. Apuleius didn't turn into an ass, but he did have experiences similar to those experienced by Lucius, for instance, when he was accused of when Lucius gives his speech after being falsely accused of a crime. Well, that was based on an actual experience that Apuleius had. All right, but I want us to think a bit about this question. What is an autobiography? What is a confessional? Whereas we're going to see this text directly influences Augustine's Confessions. How are they similar and different? In what sense is the Golden Ass the autobiography or confession of Apuleius? Something to think about. How is a self or an ego I discursively constructed in this text, or constructed in the writing of this text? How is the question of animal metamorphosis linked to the autobiography? And finally, why does Derrida, whom we're going to read later, his book, The Animal That Therefore Am, why does he call autobiographies the most toxic of literary genres? And I don't want to propose an answer to that, but it's just something I'd like you to kind of think about as we think about also the question of poisoning, which is linked to the ancient Egypto-African cultures of sorcery, and which is certainly present in this text, in which we see many of the people that practice sorcery and witchcraft are also people who poison others, and poisoning is linked to the most ancient concept of the word that we know, the Heka, which is a word which is linked to this kind of an idea of a fluid in the body that is considered to be toxic. Okay, and we've talked about this with respect to the pharmakon in Plato's the Phaedrus, when Socrates stigmatizes the written word as a form of because a dangerous supplement to speaking, or kind of calls it a pharmakon, thereby scapegoats it. Okay, so we're back to this idea of words as being like medicine, pharmaceutical products that can be dangerous, but also can be can save your life. Just like any medicine, given the right dose at the right time, it can make you can heal you, it can make you healthy. But taken and given too much, or given to the wrong person at the wrong time, it can be fatal. This is a way of thinking about what the word was in the ancient world prior to Plato. Okay, now Augustine, I think it's really interesting to know. As I said in the last lecture, he criticizes Apuleius for his work on Socrates as demon. But he most definitely borrows from Apuleius. He was certainly aware of Apuleius. They were both North African men from North Africa. And when he writes the Confessions, if we think of it in terms of, we think of the genre as a kind of a social contract between, and not often unarticulated social contract between the writer and the reader of the text. I mean, it's very clear that in terms of genre, that Augustine is influenced by Apuleius in the construction of his own confessional narrative. But in the case, obviously, of Augustine, he's speaking directly about his own personal experiences in a more forthright way than this sort of ribald, a funny story of instruction that Apuleius tells us. But there's also the similarity of the fact that both of them move from a state of being, mired in sin, being lost, to finding salvation. They both find salvation, each in their own different ways. I would mention in passing Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions as well, 1782. Wonderful and weird story about his own life. And I think this one is interesting in this context because generically it is also a kind of a confession. Rousseau confesses many things we wish that he would have just remained silent about because some of them are quite awkward. But it's a secular confession, and I think that's one of the things that makes it interesting in comparison with Augustine's confessions, because it's not a confession in the sense of in the overtly theological sense that we find in Augustine, and so it's more of a it's more of a it's the beginning of just a sort of a straight up autobiography, which becomes more characteristic of the post-Christian era and the Enlightenment tradition. Okay. Here's a map of the Roman Empire. Just a reminder here, because we are talking about a writer from Africa. I want to just make this clear. If you look and you can see where the Roman Empire was, it extended all the way up to England, Spain, France, Italy. But it was an empire that was held together through trading by sea, and so these coasts on the North Africa, these cities on the North African coast, were every bit as important and as much a part of the empire as those on the other side of the Mediterranean. And here, this is a map that was made by a Muslim from Morocco named Idrisi in the year 1154. And I like to show you this because you can see here, if you look to the far right, you can see Spain, and you can see Algeria, but the world is turned upside down. If you begin looking at it, you can see the Mediterranean. You can make out Italy there. You can see Saudi Arabia a little further to the right, and so on. But this might have been a more accurate picture of what the world would have looked like to someone like Apuleius, who was a North African man. And I want to emphasize that because many of the themes that he explores are not just themes that are relevant to the history of Western Christendom, but to kind of evade this sort of Orientalist East-West, artificially East-West distinction that Edward Said discusses in his book Orientalism. These are constructions of the world that would not have made much sense to someone like Apuleius, who wouldn't have thought of the African coast as being something separate from Europe. So, all right. Well, here's an image of some of the gods and goddesses that we'll be talking about here that appear in the story. We can see to the far left. You can see there. Again, that's Aphrodite or Venus and Cupid, which we discussed in the last lecture. And there's the goat man, Pan. You can see below them are Daphnis and Chloe, the great love story that is in the center of this narrative. And then you see Venus de Milo, which is in the Louvre in Paris. And she's a prominent figure, obviously, but so too in the far right is Isis, and there's Osiris. And it's interesting, as we're going to see, that Venus is finally going to be linked with Isis. And this is significant because we tend to think, well, let me show you the next image here. We tend to think of these cultures as being totally separate from one another. But if we look here historically, we see ancient Egypt, culture of ancient Egypt long predated Hellenic civilization, as we explored in our discussion of Timaeus and also Phaedrus, where Socrates attributes the invention of writing to Thoth. But you can see here, Egypt, I put that date there, 4000. I mean, we don't know how old it is, according to some Egyptologists like Sheikh Anta Diop, he's probably far older. But it is truly, Egypt was truly the mother of the world, and at least this part of the world. And you can see there that it goes, I put the date of 332, about 332 years before Christ, the beginning of the Common Era, because this is the period where Alexander the Great, whose teacher was Aristotle, conquered Egypt, and Egypt effectively becomes colonized, but very, very, very late in its history by Greece. Of course, Alexander was from Macedonia, but it was the Greeks who conquered that part of Africa and made it their own. And then later, the Romans kind of followed suit. A famous love story between Antony and Cleopatra. And there you can see Julius Caesar, Antony in the middle, and Cleopatra. Their encounter happened in the year 41, years before Christ, and this is the time in which Rome sort of picks up from, follows in the footsteps of the Greeks and colonizing this part of Africa. But let's be aware that this doesn't mean that the practices that prevailed prior to Greek and Roman imperialism in this region just simply disappeared. We see, Apuleius venerating the deities, from both civilizations, and we can see instances of influence from the Egyptians that are very clear in this text and remain quite relevant in understanding Africa today, the culture. I mean, I teach African studies, and I always recommend to my students, if you want to understand, the sorcery, in addition to texts like, Paul Stoller's In Sorcery's Shadow, which is a wonderful narrative account of Paul Stoller's time spent in Niger training to become a sorcerer. This happened in the 70s and 80s, and he writes about it. He does a very wonderful job of telling that story, and it's an interesting book that I highly recommend. But that kind of many of the themes, including animal metamorphosis, you'll find in Stoller's account of his training to become a sorcerer in Niger. But you can read The Golden Ass, and you can understand a great deal about sorcery that can be applied to West Africa today. So it's interesting for these reasons as well. And so I want to make sure that you're aware of that. Okay, but we've already talked about animal metamorphosis in Plato, and so we said that Apuleius is a Neoplatonic thinker. He's a Neoplatonist, like Augustine. This is one thing that they share, and as well as, say, Plotinus. These are the most prominent Neoplatonists. And we already read in Plato his view that in his view about reincarnation, that if you were not rational in this life, that when you came back in your next life, you would come back as a land animal. And so, in effect, we think of Lucius being turned into an ass. Part of it's linked to the fact that he's not being rational. He has, or as Plato says, he has no use for philosophy. So because he has no use for philosophy, he metamorphizes into an animal. Well, this is the same thing that happens in Plato, but it happens in terms of reincarnation. That one comes back. If you weren't interested in philosophy in this life, in your next life, you come back as a land animal, because you never considered the nature of the heavens, and you'd cease to use the circles in your head. Remember, then, these were the thoughts that orbit around the burning ball of Logos in the center of the amillennial sphere, which is in the brain in Timaeus, and followed the leadership parts of the soul or psyche in the breast. Okay, so in this case, the leadership would be of the soul would be the thymotic part of the soul. So these think about this little paragraph when we think about how in what sense this text is didactic, and by which I mean it seeks to teach a lesson, and what it is that Apuleius is really trying to communicate beyond being just merely telling us a good yarn, a fascinating story. What is the lesson here? And I think that when you look carefully at the language of the Golden Ass, we can see that it's not just, in my reading of the text anyway, it's not just a good story for a laugh, although there's many parts of it that are quite funny when they're not, and also, of course, grotesque. But there's also a serious intent here as well. Okay, so we want to be clear then, we want to make a distinction between, we already talked about this when we were talking about Cupid and Psyche, but her Psyche's curiosity, that Plato makes the same distinction between mere animal curiosity, like what a dog might have, or the kind of curiosity that killed the cat, and philosophical questioning. The idea that what makes us human beings is that we ask the question, say that someone like Heidegger would call the question that's first in rank. We ask the question of being, non-being, what Aristotle called the principle of non-contradiction, which inaugurates the Western philosophical tradition. So men, people, human beings ask the question of why they are here instead of not being here. They do philosophy. They think deep thoughts as opposed to being merely curious. Animals are merely curious. And so Plato is going to have Timaeus say, if some think there is no difference between opinion and intelligence, what we perceive through our physical senses must be taken as the most certain reality. Now, this is Lucius's downfall, because he does take what presents itself to our physical senses as the most certain reality. He's not attending to that other real reality, that more transcendental reality, which he's going to learn to come to venerate in the telling of this narrative. Plato says, now there is no doubt that the two are different in origin and nature. One is produced by teaching, the other by persuasion. Okay, this is again that philosophical difference between philosophy and rhetoric, and in the Platonic tradition as well as the Aristotelian tradition. Rhetoric is always subordinated to philosophy. Philosophy, dialectical, philosophical discussion is about discovering the truth. Rhetoric is about disseminating that truth to others, and often in the case others who aren't capable of reaching it or finding it themselves through their use of philosophy. One involves truth and rational argument. The other, which would be rhetoric, is irrational. Okay. All right. So in the case of Lucius, we want to distinguish between, his curiosity, which is the curiosity, as we've said, of similar to the curiosity of Psyche, and then the desire to find true knowledge. And so he's going to, one of the things that we're going to see is that Lucius is going to graduate in effect from being an entity, a being who is merely curious and is interested and has this enormous sexual appetite and is curious about sorcery, to being somebody who has learned to do truly reflective thinking and to move beyond into an understanding of what is really true and what is really real and what is really important. And he becomes quite devout and quite religious. And this is the same story that we find in Augustine's Confessions. It's the same. So I'm not saying Augustine plagiarized from Apuleius. Augustine's Confessions, by the way, is a wonderful read. It remains a fascinating read all these years later, just as does Apuleius's narrative. And although Augustine is meditating on, he's talking about things that actually happened to him, there's no question that what gives it his narrative, his Confessions form in the generic sense is this generic predecessor that he's drawing from, which is Apuleius' Golden Ass. Okay. Lucius tells us, I was already disposed to curiosity, and as soon as I heard mentioned the art of magic, which I had always prayed for, so far from taking precautions from Pamphile, I was eager, even without compulsion, to undergo such schooling willingly and to pay a heavy price for it. In short, I was all for taking a running jump and landing myself headlong in those murky depths. All right, so he's not using his head here. He's merely curious. Like I once had a cat who would stick its head inside of glass bottles and almost suffocate it because it wanted to find out what was inside of the glass bottle, and it couldn't get its head out. When then it got itself in trouble. I remember once I got my cat and I had to hold it down and break open the glass with a hammer before it suffocated. Well, this is what Lucius is doing. He's not using his noggin. He's not thinking. He's just curious. All right. Now I want to note here before going any further and talking about this running jump that he makes, or leap into foolhardy running leap, we should say. Notice again, art of magic. Now, etymologically, as we're going to discuss, the word magic in the English language has an origin in the Egyptian word Heka, which is the word for magic, which we'll want to explore a little bit more here. Can't go too far into it, but just at least in passing, because the idea of what magic was in the ancient world of the Egyptians and what is still present in the time of Apuleius was, again, construed as a kind of a occult fluid, literally a poison. And again, this is also why poison is important to the world of sorcery. And as we're going to see, when Pamphile turns herself into an owl, she does so by taking a kind of a potion, much like what Psyche had hoped to find in that little box when she went to Hades, thinking of magic as being, in this sense, something that is in the realm of what Plato would call becoming, something that has an actual tangible existence. This is going to be very different from the idea of I mean, in that sense, let me say it this way: there can be evil Heka for the Egyptians, just as there can be bad Heka or good Heka for the Egyptians. You remember, it's ambivalent, like the pharmacon itself. It can be both at the same time. But this idea that there is something inherent in the actual substance of the word that's spoken itself, in a sense of, like, say, put it in terms of the primal elements of wind and saliva or fluid of the body. And that would imply that the magic is imbued in the actual breath that is spoken. This is linked to the idea of magic and pronouncing magic spells. And this is precisely the kind of idea or thinking of the word, say the word is logos, that Apuleius is keen to reject. But at this point in the narrative, Lucius wants to immerse himself in that kind of thinking of magic and of words and the art of magic. He's rushing in a foolhardy way down a very dangerous path. Okay. Excuse me. Okay. So let's see. Now we get this story. I should let me say before we go too far into this that there's a story in when we get further down into the narrative, when poor Lucius is running around and he's an ass and he's trying to get back, he's trying to get his human shape back. At one point he's having to hide out in this on the upstairs of this house, and he hears these men talking downstairs who are looking for him, and he's so curious that he peeps out the window and he becomes like the peeping ass, And I think of also this idea of his ears growing. The more curious he is, the more his ears, grow longer. Much like the donkey in the Pinocchio story is that the more, let's say, the more he has, the more he indulges his animal nature, the more ass-like he becomes. But he alludes to a fable of Aesop, which he kind of says, "Oh, this is where it came from. This is all tongue in cheek. This is obviously not where Aesop's fable came from." But it's an interesting point of reference to understanding what Apuleius's probable intentions are in thinking about the more didactic aspects of this narrative. Okay, so here's the fable from Aesop, the peeping ass in his shadow. It says, a traveler hired an ass. The day was hot, and the traveler sat in the shadow of the ass. The owner argued that he didn't hire the shadow, or he didn't rent out the shadow. The ass got away as they argued about the shadow. All right, so the moral of the story: in quarreling about the shadow, we often lose the substance. Okay, now these Aesop's fables function much like Christian parables. They're little stories, but they're stories that have a didactic point to them, and and this didactic point of this little fable is also relevant to the narrative that we're reading. Lucius is quite literally the ass, but the obsession with shadows, like the man who says, I didn't rent the shadow to you, so you got to pay me for the shadow, as well as the ass, is certainly relevant to the Platonic. If we think of the Platonic idea of, let's say, if we take the allegory of the cave in the Republic, remember that the men who are down in Plato's cave are chained. They're chained to to the floor. They can't look to the left. They can't look to the right. All they can do is look straight ahead, and behind them is a fire that's reflecting images on the wall that are effectively shadows. And then, of course, the very famous allegory, the men that are chained to the floor and these chairs think that the shadows are real, as opposed to what is really real. Philosopher's the one, obviously, who gets out of the chair, walks into the sunlight. But Lucius is in his before he experiences salvation or redemption. He's chasing shadows. He's interested in appearance, and sorcery again is linked to this, the idea of the world of becoming, the world of appearance. To put it in Platonic terms, he is not interested in what is really true. He's not interested in what in what is in what is eternal. He's just interested in passing physical pleasures. Okay, we'll see this, for instance, with his relationship with Photis, that this young woman that he has this sexual relationship with, that she's attracted to how she appears. Again, this is this distinction we talked about in Derrida, the difference between the qui and the quoi, the who and the what. He's interested not in the who, but in the what. She's a beautiful girl. She appears wonderful, and so he has this sort of enjoyment in a sensual sense. This is very similar to what we saw in the story about in the story of Plato's Phaedrus, in his discussion of Lysias and his interest in Phaedrus, which is in how in what because Phaedrus is a beautiful, handsome youth. He's interested in what how Phaedrus appears, or what Phaedrus is, as opposed to put it in these Derridian terms, into who Phaedrus is, which is what Socrates is attracted to Phaedrus too. But he's interested in something more than who Phaedrus appears to be. He's interested in what really is the truth, the true. So Lucius the Ass tells us the argument between these men about looking for him that he overheard, conducted with noisy altercations, reached my ears, and being a naturally inquisitive ass, he's a curious ass, just like Psyche, imbued with restless impulses, I craned my neck and tried to peer out through the small window to see what all the noise was about. The men below could not stop laughing and joking at my peering out, and this is the origin of the much quoted proverb about the peeping shadow and its ass. So this is a kind of a funny appropriation of Aesop's fable. Not true, of course. Now, let's look at this discussion of his interest in Photis and how she appears. Now, I want you to, as we're looking at this, I want you to pay particular attention to the language that he uses here, because it's going to be a direct kind of parody, a profane parody of the apparition of Venus. We think of Venus coming out of this the Botticelli image of Venus coming rising out of the waves and being this apparition of the absolute an absolute apparition of beauty. So Photis is actually literally going to mock the goddess Venus by posing as her, and he's going to be very aroused by this mocking of Venus. And that's right after Photis mocks Venus and he has sexual relations with her, that he becomes turned into an ass. And so it's in these two passages, what we're going to look at here and later, what we'll look at when we see when the goddess actually does appear and redeems him, and Lucius experiences salvation, regains his human form. It's written in the same language, in effect, or some of the imagery is the same, but it is a more sacred as opposed to this profane version that we see here. And so here's Apuleius. He says, I was spellbound at the sight of the beautiful Photis and stood there lost in admiration. The parts of me that were asleep now stood to attention. Okay, there's a lot of this kind of language in the text. Finally, I managed to speak to her. My dear Photis, I said, how lusciously and attractively you wiggle that wee pot and your bottom with it. That's a succulent dish you have in readiness there. How lucky a fellow would be if you let him stick his finger in. He'd be on top of the world. Okay, now I want to note here too, there's an interesting dialogue or an interesting discussion here that he goes off on a kind of a rant about or digression about hair, the hair of women. And there's a really fascinating literature in the ancient world about women's hair, where we get this idea that long luxurious locks are appropriate to women. The Apostle Paul, who was probably bald, is going to say men should not have their hair long because it would be an abomination. Whereas, women, it's appropriate to them to have hair, and hair becomes a kind of a veil. The idea of veil is linked, that the veil is linked to what's hidden. And we see the goddess, Venus with the long hair. So we think of, hair is linked to the question of desire too, because there's no, desire in this sense, in this erotic sense, depends on what's hidden. There can't be desire unless there's something that is concealed. And so the hair serves in the function of concealing. But also, it's interesting to note that in the ancient world, there were these very strange beliefs about women's hair and how it would drew forth the semen from the men, and if men had long hair themselves, it would diminish their semen. So there's a long literature on this, but it's kind of bizarre in modern terms, but it's also kind of funny too. And we let's hear what Lucius has to say about hair. He says, "How enchanting is a woman's hair when its pleasing color and glossy sheen shines out. When it faces the sun's rays, it is enlivened and flashes fire or gently reflects the sunlight. Sometimes it offers contrasting pleasures by varying its appearance. Hair with a golden glow subsides into the soft shaded color of honey. Hair which is raven black seeks to rival the ultramarine necks of doves. Hair oiled with drops of Arabian perfume, parted with fine teeth of a sharp comb and gathered at the back, serves as a mirror when it confronts the lover's eyes and affords him a more flattering reflection. Such is the lofty status of a woman's hair that she can appear before us adorned with gold, fine clothes, jewelry, and the rest of her finery. But unless she has ordered her hair, she cannot be regarded as well groomed." All right, so he, he certainly appreciates the hair of Photis as well, as we'll see. But I want to note this. Here's a quote from the Apostle Paul again. A woman ought to have a symbol of authority on their heads, lest they tempt the angels. We won't go too much into the question of the veil in Paul, but I note this in passing because here he seems to be influenced by this. There was this ancient, belief that there was a race of giants in the time, say, of Noah and the ark fame, and they came into being because angels were seduced by the beautiful hair of women, and they came down to earth and they had sexual relations with women, and that led to the birth of this race of giants who all disappeared in the great flood, with the exception of one named Waj, who's mentioned in like the Talmud, for instance. But here we find Paul even referring to this legend about how the hair of women is so powerfully seductive that it can tempt the angels themselves. So they should wear the veil on behalf of the angels. Okay, so here we're going to see Photis mocking Venus. Now look there on the far left, you'll see an image of Venus. And note the picture. This is the Botticelli painting of Venus as well. You can see the position of her hands concealing herself is very similar. Think about this when we're reading the description that we're going to see in Apuleius, and then you see Venus there on the far right with her hair as being a prominent feature that's identified with her and her great beauty. All right, so here's Lucius, and he's looking at Photis. He's very drawn to her. He says, she's the worker who works in the house, who helps him. She's going to help him become metamorphose into an owl. Right. So Lucius says, "Once I felt the impact of cruel Cupid's first arrow in the depth of my heart. I stretched my bow strongly, likewise." And I am mortally afraid that the string may break through being drawn too tightly. All right, so there's the bow is he's speaking there of what, let us say the bow of love. Now indulge me a little further, Photis. Let your hair run free and flow over me in waves as you offer me your love embrace. She stripped off her clothes and let her hair flow loose. Then with the show of genial wantonness, she adopted the charming pose of Venus treading the ocean waves. Okay, well, there you have it. This is a kind of a mocking or a parody of the goddess, the kind of mocking that that we saw in the story of Psyche and Cupid would probably offend the great deity. She even for a moment covered her hairless parts with her rosy hand, a deliberate gesture rather than a modest concealment. So it's not a modest concealment, it's a provocative gesture to arouse him. Then she bounced up and down, repeatedly maneuvering her back in supple movements, and gorged me with the delight of rhythmical intercourse. Okay. Now, Photis, then after they spend the day, tucked away in his room having sex, she says, "Well, I'll take you now." And the mistress of the house is a witch, and she's in the back of her, sort of witch chamber, or I think it's upstairs, and she's practicing her craft, and she's going to help Lucius hide himself so he can watch and see what she does, so he too can imitate her and transform himself into an owl, like she has done. Okay, so let's read the description. This is Pamphile Becomes an Owl. So he said, Lucius tells us, just as darkness fell, Photis led me silently on tiptoe to the upper chamber of Pamphile and instructed me to witness what was happening through a chink in the door. Pamphile first divested herself of all her clothing. She then opened a small casket and took from it several boxes. She removed the lid from one of these and extracted ointment from it. There we have again the box and the magical potion within it, the Heka, if we want to put it in the Egyptian terms. Then she rubbed for some time between her hands, and then smeared it all over herself from the tips of her toes to the crown of her head. She next held a long and private conversation with the lamp, and proceeded to flap her arms and legs with a trembling motion. As she gently moved them up and down, soft feathers began to sprout on them, and sturdy wings began to grow. Her nose became curved and hard, and her nails became talons. In this way, Pamphile became an owl. All right, now this is you could read Carlos Castaneda's the Teachings of Don Juan, where he the young initiate who wants to become a sorcerer himself goes to it's in I think it's either in New Mexico or it's actually in Mexico. He takes peyote buttons and he learns from this the sorcerer Don Juan how to also practice animal metamorphosis. And so this is this was probably bogus, but he did present it as an anthropology thesis. I think it was at UC Berkeley. Carlos Castaneda did. Whether it was true or false or just more fantasy. It's interesting again that animal metamorphosis and sorcery they go hand in glove, and they always have. Okay. All right, so Lucius becomes an ass. So now Lucius, he wants a piece of this. Again, his curiosity is getting him in trouble. So he says, Photis crept into the chamber and took a box from the casket. First, I hugged and kissed it and prayed that it would bring me happy flying hours. He too is going to get up there and fly in the sky. Then I hastily tore off all my clothes, dipped my hands eagerly into the box, drew out a good quantity of the ointment, and rubbed all my limbs with it. I then flapped my arms up and down, imitating the movements of a bird. But no sign of feathers appeared. Instead, the hair on my body was becoming coarse bristles, and my tender skin was hardening into a hide. There were no longer 5 fingers at the extremities of my hands, for each was compressed into one hoof. From the base of my spine protruded an enormous tail. My face became misshapen, my mouth widened, my nostrils flared open, my lips became pendulous, and my ears huge and bristly. The sole consolation I could see in this wretched transformation was the swelling of my penis. All right, well, now that's pretty comical, because here he is. He's been turned into an ass, but he's at least happy about this. So you can say he's got a lot of trials to go through before he's able to overcome, his orientation that he has at this time. Though because I have this large penis, but now I can't embrace Photis. All right, so it's not going to do me any good. But we'll see later. It gets even more graphic, and as he there are images of bestiality in this text that are very unusual. Not like it's unlike much of what you come across in well, they're just very graphically striking images. As I helplessly surveyed the entire length of my body and came to the realization that I was not a bird, but an ass, I tried to complain at what Photis had done to me, but I was now deprived of the human faculties of gesture and speech. All right, but Photis consoles him, saying, "Just choose some roses, and you will stop becoming an ass, and at once you will become my Lucius again." Okay, so note there, the first thing that happens to him when he, becomes an ass is that he loses speech. Okay, there we have that same kind of thing that we've seen in Plato. Animals don't have speech. This is one of the things that differentiates humans and animals. Is not just the faculty of being able to do philosophy, but having logos, which is to say, speech, which becomes the definitive definition in the thinking of Descartes. But I note here too, this reference to rose is very important because Venus is going to be associated with roses. We're going to see this is in the Catholic tradition today. Mary is also associated with roses, and it's the venerate. And a rose is a very it's a vaginal image, to put it in Freudian terms. And so the rose is because a rose, has the character or similar to the appearance of a vagina, and so he has to, but it's a sacred image in this case, and so what he needs is to to find these rose petals, and this will help him transform himself back into a human. But it's not a matter of magic. If the roses were just magic, like the potion, he would be still in that world of sorcery. The roses he has to do far more than eat roses. He has to go through these trials and come to a veneration of the deity, who we've seen, or the goddess Venus, which is to say the feminine, the image of the basic feminine principle, and we've seen that in what we just saw prior to his being turned into an ass, he was in a posture of mocking this eternal feminine principle that Venus represents. Okay, now here are some images of the god Heka is said to be one of the oldest deities. Again, it's just a word that means breath, spirit, magic, as it etymologically is handed down in the English language. So we get this word magic, the idea that you can say something and that through the magic of the words that you speak, some kind of change will take place in the empirical external world. So it's a very, very old belief. It's akin to what we discussed when we looked at Gorgias's. We talked briefly about Gorgias's encomium to Helen, and when he says, "Well, don't blame Helen because Paris, poured this poison into her words, and so when she ran off to Troy, she was drugged." All right, and so Heka has that same kind of association. So the word as Heka is very different from the word as logos. Heka means magic, but it also means word. It can be a curse, but it's literally a kind of a fluid of the body that is, say, expectorated into the ear of the other. One instance of this is like in ancient Egypt. The writing was also imbued with Heka. Whether it's writing, you could say in Plato, writing partakes of the pharmakon. Heka, the spoken word is somehow eludes that kind of scapegoating. So we get again that logic of the dangerous supplement that we already discussed. But in this case, the Egyptian context, the spoken word was every bit as poisonous as the written word. And in the case of the scrolls that were thrown into the coffins of the dead, these were maps that could lead you to the underworld. But it didn't matter if you could read or not, because you could also drink the liquid and it would go into your body. The magic or the Heka would go into your body through your mouth. So it doesn't whether it goes into the ear or the mouth, it doesn't matter as long as it goes in. And so it's a materialism, because there's no transcendental ideal realm of which the spoken word is said to represent, but it's an occult materialism, because the word, it's more than just a sort of, to put it in Augustinian terms, a sign is a thing that points to another thing. Well, this isn't just a thing that points to another thing. This is a thing that is significant in itself, the spoken word, because it's imbued with this occult niyama. And so Heka is the god that is associated with magic and with the spoken word. And so this is also, again, why the word is said to be linked to the pharmacy, to poisoning. This is a novel. Obviously, many, many poisonings in this novel, but we also see instances of adultery. Okay, so remember, adultery is not just having sex, um, you know, and we made that distinction between fornication and adultery. Now, this is a pre-Christian world, or Christianity is coming in. In fact, Apuleius is responding to it really in a negative way. But adultery would be sex, outside of the promise that you made to someone else, and so it's the poisoners, and it's usually women in this text, and they're very stigmatized in that sense. So there is a kind of an undercurrent of misogyny as well that lingers in the text. But nonetheless, the poisoners, the women who poison their husbands and their children in this narrative, are also adulterers, because adultery is in effect a kind of sorcery, because it's linked to vow breaking, or the breaking of covenants. Okay, so we can think of a curse then, for instance, as a kind of magic. If you curse someone, you've spoken a magical utterance that will have some kind of effect in the world. But the same is true of, say, of a blessing, which would be the opposite, because the word would have a kind of a power that is imbued within it. Okay, so this is a very different way of thinking about words, very ancient way of thinking about words, as kind of an occult materialism it's pre-Platonic, and it's pre-Christian as well. Okay, all right. Apuleius will point out, that this is an earlier passage where he says, the most repellent hags or witches, change their outward appearance by transforming themselves into any creature. And they creep in so surreptitiously that they easily escape the eyes, even of the sun god himself and of the goddess Justice. For they take on the shape of birds, or again of dogs or mice, or even flies. So when these sorcerers, when these hags, these witches become metamorphized into other animals, they are dangerous creatures who perform attacks upon their enemies, and sometimes upon other witches. Okay, so let's to get an understanding of this of the kind of thinking about the word that emerges in the post-Platonic, post-Christian era, or the Christian era. Here's a interesting quote from the biblical text, Gospel of Mark, where Jesus is being rebuked by Pharisees for dining with tax collectors and prostitutes, and then the assumption would be that, like, for instance, in many parts of Africa today, where people eat out of a common eating bowl, he would be eating with the same, from with his hands from the same dish as other people, and the anxiety would be that he would get some of their, bodily fluids would enter his body by virtue of sharing a common meal, and this would be a kind of, he would become sort of poisoned or polluted by having their fluids. Just as the opposite is true, for instance, in many parts of, let's say, Africa today, where if you eat a dinner, if you have a meal with a holy man, you can get some of his broth. It can be kind of a blessing. But here, the Pharisees are saying, "Why are you eating with these people? They've defiled you by your eating with them." And he responds, "Don't you understand? Nothing that enters a man from the outside can defile him, because it does not enter his heart, but goes into the stomach and is then eliminated." He then continued, "What comes out of him, it is what comes out of a man that is what defiles him, not what goes in." So this is a direct repudiation of the idea of the word as a kind of a heka, or magic, or a poison. It seems to be more of an affirmation of this Augustinian understanding of the word, which is a very Platonic understanding of a word, which is a thing that points to another thing, but is in itself, insignificant. Whereas, with the heka, the significance of the word is not exhausted with its signifying capacity. It's powerful for what it is, more not just because of what it signifies. Now, there are instances that there seems to be some ambivalence as well, because there's a case, for instance, when you think of Jesus healing a blind man, he spits on the ground, takes the saliva, mixes it with dirt, puts it in the eyes of the blind man, and this cures the blind man. So this would seem to be kind of a residual link to this older way of thinking about language that enters into the Christian tradition. All right, so here's a case of this horrible woman who later Lucius is sentenced, or is she's sentenced to have public sex with him, and he's horrified at the prospect because she's a murderess who's killed her husband and her own daughter through poison, and she's an adulterer. Okay, so the woman who poisoned her husband showed herself to be the same kind of mother as she had proved a wife. She contrived a meal suited to the occasion with the same potion that she killed her husband. She prostrated both the physician's wife and her own daughter. The baleful drug made short work of the little girl's soft and tender internal organs and put an end to her frail life. This was the woman with whom I was to be joined publicly in marriage. All right, so she is her. There's a story we're going to look at in just a minute where Lucius has in the shape of an ass has sex with a woman who wants to have sex with him, but it's a very discreet affair. She doesn't want anybody to know. Whereas, in this case, the woman that he is to have sex with is a criminal, a murderer, and her punishment is to publicly have to copulate with him in front of crowds of people. Now, at this time, this wasn't that uncommon. I think even in the modern world, there are instances where it's very grotesque. People pay to watch these instances of bestiality. Well, Lucius is this is at the point where he's gone through so many trials, and he's at the end of his rope, where now he has to have sex with this criminal in a public forum. But as we get towards the end of his trials, he notes he does it somewhat tongue in cheek, but he also, because he's still speaking as a. I mean, here's the irony: when this passage that we're going to look at comes, he's still speaking he's still an ass. I mean, he's an ass that's doing philosophy, and this makes him. And then he says, "Well, it's not appropriate." He backs off. He says, "It's not appropriate for an ass to do philosophy." There's a kind of a little slip there, but maybe it's also a case of him. Starting to repent, because it comes towards the end of his trial. So he's getting to the place where he's starting to understand the difference between mere animal curiosity and philosophizing. Okay, so he's thinking about Socrates, who also was killed through the use of poison. What sort of trial was that conducted before those shrewd Athenian legislators who were teachers of every form of knowledge? That old man, Socrates, possessed divine foresight. The god of Delphi pronounced him preeminent in wisdom before all other mortals. This is where Socrates, goes and visits the Oracle of Delphi, and it tells him, "You, Socrates, are the wisest of men." Although he then says, "Well, then my wisdom must consist in the fact that I know that I don't know anything, and everybody else thinks that they do." So it's a sort of a rebuke to the Cartesian, in antiquity, speaking anachronistically, a rebuke to this sort of Cartesian notion of certainty, because wisdom for Socrates begins with the exact opposite: not knowing, not being certain. Yet was he, Socrates, not encompassed by the deceit and envy of a most wicked clique, these elders in Athens, on the grounds that he was corrupting the youth, when in fact he was bridling and restraining them? And was he not executed by the juice of that baleful plant, the hemlock, stamping on his fellow citizens the stigma of enduring disgrace? Okay, so again, in the eyes of the ancient Athenians, Socrates was no philosopher, because philosophy didn't really exist, not as Plato and Socrates thought of it. He was a sorcerer, and so since he had corrupted the youth of Athens with his baleful words, the poison that he had poured in their ears, now he too must take some of his own medicine. And then Lucius says, "Well, for even today, outstanding philosophers prefer his most sacred school to all others, and in the loftiest pursuit of happiness, they swear by his name." All right, so Lucius is moving to form a little bit more wisdom. All right, now here's this interesting description. I won't read it all because it's too graphic, but I'll read some of it, where Lucius makes love to this lady who summons him. As the lady stripped herself stark naked, removing even the band which confined her lovely breasts. She kissed me hard, not the sort of kisses casually offered in the brothel, but those sincerely offered from the heart. She also addressed me affectionately with, "I love you. You are my only love." Then she grabbed my halter and made me lie as I had learned to do. And then there's more language. I was sorely exercised and considerably fearful, wondering how I could mount such a fragile lady with my 4 hulking legs and hard hoofs. All right, this is what I think for many contemporary readers, it makes it kind of difficult to accept this narrative as having a didactic function when you got these kinds of graphic passages. But I think it's interesting to reflect on. You think about who is the irrational one here: the animal who has no speech, or the woman who is saying "I love you" to an animal who even an animal she doesn't know, and saying it sincerely. I mean, it kind of throws into doubt all of our questions about there are distinctions between man as being the rational animal, and the animal as being completely irrational because it lacks language. But of course we have to remember, it had been part of the sort of the misogyny of the period, is that the woman, it is a woman after all, and so this would imply that her status in this Platonic logos phallo-logocentric hierarchy would be only a small, would be a smaller step above Lucius. It certainly wouldn't be the same as a man, at least in putting it in Platonic terms. Okay. All right. So Lucius, now he, when he starts thinking about this is the woman who takes him discreetly to her room. Now he has to have sex with this criminal who was a murderer, who's poisoned people, and he has to do it in public. He starts, he's the shame at the prospect of public copulation, and disgust at being besearched by this foul female criminal afflicted me. But I was also in agony of torment through fear of death. I edged unobtrusively forward until I reached the nearest gate, and then I took off at full gallop. So he flees. He's tried to flee many times before, find those roses, get out of this terrible condition that he finds himself in. But he's never been successful. But this time, the goddess appears to him and has mercy upon him, and he experiences a kind of redemption. So we want to compare this description of Venus, the goddess, with what we saw earlier in the more profane version where he's having sex with Photis. He says, "At that moment, I beheld the full moon rising from the sea wave." Now note, like for instance, Mary, the Virgin Mary in the Christian tradition is associated with the moon. So it's the principle of the moon, this feminine principle. "And gleaming with special brightness, I became aware that the supreme goddess wielded her power with exceeding majesty, that human affairs were controlled wholly by her providence. So I decided to address a prayer to the venerable image of the goddess appearing before my eyes. With this feminine light of yours," he says to her, "you brighten every city and nourish the luxuriant seeds with your moist fire, bestowing your light intermittently according to the wandering paths of the sun. Grant respite and peace to the harsh afflictions I have endured. Let this be the full measure of my toils and hazards. Rid me of this grisly, four-footed form. Restore me to the sight of my kin. Make me again the Lucius that I was." All right, so we can think here again of the trials of Psyche before she obtains mortality and immortality. And again, it's her. It was just like with Lucius. It was her curiosity that did her in. She was being mired down by her animal curiosity, as was Lucius. But the goddess will have mercy on Lucius, and he will experience salvation. He will gain the kind of immortality that Psyche also gained. Now, here's a very famous image of Botticelli's The Birth of Venus, painted in 1485 to 1486, and it's quite interesting. You can see how each of these different traditions were influenced by one another. But what we see in the prose description of Venus in the text of Apuleius is very similar to what we see in the famous painting by Botticelli. Lucius tells us, scarcely had I closed my eyes when suddenly from the midst of the sea a divine figure arose, revealing features worthy of veneration even by the gods. Then gradually the gleaming form seemed to stand before me in full figure as she shook off the seawater. I think this exact same language, but in a profane context, was used when he was having sex with Photis. I shall try to acquaint you too with the detail of her wondrous appearance, if only the poverty of human speech grants me powers of description, or the deity herself endows me with a rich feast of eloquent utterance. Okay, because again, we're talking about the ineffable, the transcendent, and human. It's beyond our ability to articulate in ordinary discourse, because he's apprehending the revelation of the divine. To begin with, she had a full head of hair which hung down. There we have the hair again, gradually curling as it spread loosely and flowed gently over her divine neck. Her lofty head was encircled by a garland interwoven with diverse blossoms, at the center of which, above her brow, was a flat disk resembling a mirror, or rather the orb of the moon, which emitted a glittering light. There we have again the kind of the aura halo effect. The crown was held in place by coils of rearing snakes on right and left. This is we can think of the Medusa also has these snakes that emanate from the head, and to put it in Freudian terms, we could think of the snakes as having this sort of phallic, appearance. And as Freud's going to say, the purpose of the snakes in the head of the Medusa is to mitigate the fear of castration. Now, another way to say this is that the goddess is a figure, is a kind of a choral figure, and as such is very, to put it in embodied terms, is a figure of quite literally the female genitals. And so this is what I think this is an interesting allusion too, because it connects the goddess with the Platonic idea of the chora. Such then was the appearance of the mighty goddess. All right, now she tells, Venus tells Lucius that, she says, I have many, many names, because she is the eternal feminine principle. And so she's manifested herself as Minerva, Diana, Circe, we get in the Odysseus story, turns men also in Metamorphosis into swine, Juno, Hecate, so there are many avatars of the deity. But she tells us that above all, her earlier name is Isis. Well, this is again, like we saw in the Phaedrus with the reference to Thoth as being the inventor of writing, that, again, Egypt is a far older culture. And so the true deity is Isis. But we start getting into these kinds of mysteries into which Lucius becomes initiated when he becomes devoted to the Isis cult and also to the Osiris cult as well. We get some really kind of bizarre but interesting and anthropological sense of what these kinds of practices might have been in the ancient world when he describes some of these rites. And it's hard to doubt that in this case, where this is serious stuff, much like when we think of Augustine's conversion, it wasn't just for literary effect. So here you can see, remnants of this kind of thinking of the feminine in our culture. We have Venus on the far left, Mary in the center there, the Virgin Mary, who's often apparitions of Mary are attended with, roses. Then we have the wanton boy on Valentine's Day, Cupid, who comes bringing chocolates and roses. Lupercalia, I mentioned earlier, to beware the Ides of February. The 15th of February was the day when, that this celebration of Venus and Cupid took place, which involved, the sacrifice of a goat. It's really interesting how that got shifted from the 15th of February to the 14th, and how, we still have residual elements of these ancient rites in our culture today. Okay, she says to him, Lucius, the troubles which you have endured have been many and diverse. You have been driven before the heavy storms and the heaviest gales of fortune, but you have finally reached the harbor of peace and the altar of mercy, much like, Psyche. In the green years of youth, you tumbled on the slippery slope into slavish pleasures and gained the ill-omened reward of your unhappy curiosity. Let unbelievers see you, and as they see you, let them recognize the errors of their ways. So here is the didactic nature of the story. And we are to then, again, if we were to apply it to our own lives, we see that we too should beware of falling into the pitfalls that Lucius fell into. Okay, so he says, I had been initiated into the rites of the goddess, but had not yet been enlightened by the sacred mysteries of that great god and highest father of the gods, the unconquered Osiris. And there you see on the right from the Egyptian Book of the Dead, you see Osiris, the fish god, with his scales, and behind him is Isis and Iphthys, his two wives, and in front of him is Ani. And so, these rites, these what I referred to earlier is the Egyptian, monomyth, the practicing of this rite along the Nile that took place for thousands of years before Christian Eros, is very, very ancient, religious practices linked to Egypt. And so he doesn't get too much into that, but he tells us that's where he is headed in the future as someone who's been initiated into the cult of Venus, which is in fact the cult of Isis. Okay, here's some final questions for consideration as we go forward. Is the Golden Ass mere ribald entertainment, or is it a didactic work for our moral well-being? Now, from the way I've presented this, I think the answer to this is pretty clear, but there are other interpretations of it out there who might not agree with the interpretation that I'm giving today. What is allegory? How did it function in the ancient world? Is the Golden Ass an allegorical tale? And I would note again, too, that although allegory is associated with Christian theology, like, for instance, in Augustine's On Christian Doctrine and the thinking of Origen, who developed allegorical methods of interpretation in ancient Christendom, the allegorical interpretations of texts like, let's say, the Homeric text are far older than the Christian tradition, and it was also obviously in the Judaic tradition as well. So allegory was not just linked to Christianity; it was a part and parcel, of the ancient world. And many stories that were told were deliberately intended to be read in these allegorical fashions. Now, I think the easiest way to remember what an allegory is, if you're not familiar with this term, it's an extended parable, like when Jesus tells parables, or like the Aesop's Fable that we read. That these are not just stories for entertainment, but they have a kind of a moral lesson to them that we can apply to our own lives. What are the Golden Ass's contributions towards the inauguration of the genre of the autobiography? I think this is a really important question for students of literature. How is the Golden Ass a critique of the new religion in North Africa at this time, Christianity? This is an interesting question. We haven't really pursued it much here, but it's one I think worthy of reflection. On what grounds does the Golden Ass stigmatize sorcery, the ancient Egypto-African, religious practices that precede the coming of the Platonic tradition, the Neoplatonic tradition, in the form of Apuleius, Plotinus, and Augustine? And then finally, what contribution does the Golden Ass make toward the historical development of the concept of the psyche or the soul? Okay, now I think this is a particularly important question, and I hope that we've made that sufficiently clear, but this will effectively bring an end to this particular lecture. And so the next lecture that we'll have in this series I'll have two lectures on Freud's Totem and Taboo, and how he handles the theme of animal metamorphosis in those lectures.